very much for your time. And we'll roll straight into panel 3. And again, for our panel speakers, as I introduce you, please turn on your cameras if you can and get ready with that unmute button. Joining me in our final panel today, which is to discuss enabling data use, we have Sally Box, the Australian Government's Threatened Species Commissioner with the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, Petra Kuhnert, a data scientist from Data 61 specialising in environment, Jane Stewart, the Program Lead for Forest and Land Services at the Australian Bureau of Agriculture and Resource Economic Sciences at the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, Stephen Wan, a research scientist and leader of the Language and Social Computing team at Data 61, Jeremy Groves, the Data Analytics Team Leader in Geospatial and Information Analytics Branch of Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. Oh, it's quite the door show, this last panel. And last but not least is Nick Van Beest, who is a Senior Researcher at Data 61 and leads the Business Process and Legal Informatics team. To kick us off, I'd love to invite Sally to just talk a little bit about your experience. We recognise that after the 2019 and 20 summer bushfires, you were asked to establish and chair a new wildlife and threatened species bushfire recovery expert panel, which was charged with providing advice to the government on a whole range of impacts across state and federal lines. Can you talk to us a little bit in the context of why data access and use is so valuable to do what you're trying to do?
Thanks, Alicia, and hi, everybody. Look, the 2019-20 bushfires in Australia were really unprecedented. They burnt more than 10 million hectares, just a really unusually large area, and in many places burnt with an unusually high intensity, and it was described by many as an ecological disaster. The scale was so large that 7 state and territory jurisdictions were affected, and so a national perspective on environmental impacts and a national conservation response was required. Many Australian ecosystems are fire adapted, but fires are usually localised and animals can escape to a nearby refuge and recolonise areas once they recover. But in this case, the scale was just so large. So species like the kangaroo island dunnart had more than 95% of their distribution burnt in these fires. And species like the green carpenter bee, which occur in vastly different parts of the country, had both of their significant populations burnt in the same fire. So we're really facing a pretty unusual situation. So in January, while the fires were still burning, the Minister for the Environment asked me to convene a wildlife and threatened species bushfire recovery expert panel, and our role was to advise on the spatial and ecological information to assess bushfire impacts on plants and animals and ecological communities, to assist the Australian Government to prioritise species and locations in need of management intervention, and to advise on the recovery actions needed. So I brought together a team of 8 scientists, with our conservation biologists, fire ecologists, captive breeding specialists and decision scientists, plus we brought in the states and territories as expert advisors to this panel. So the analysis needed to be done really rapidly to inform the response. Some actions really needed to happen during the fire or immediately after to be effective. Things like emergency salvage of fish species from rivers before they were just washed out by ash and sediment, or feral predator management in the immediate aftermath of the fire to give native species the upper hand on cats and foxes. But the scale of assessment with 10 million hectares burnt was absolutely huge. So what we did was we combined the available spatial data and expertise within the department with expert input from panel members, but also from the network of scientists that they had access to, as well as representatives from the states and territories. The information we had available was imperfect, but we needed a rapid response. So I'm very grateful to the panel members who recognised this and took a pretty pragmatic approach. So I thought I'd just sort of describe what we did and what some of our successes were and some of the challenges. And I'll focus on species, even though we looked at a broad range of environmental assets. So by mid-January, while the fires were still burning, what we've done is assess the spatial overlap between fire extent and species distribution of species that are listed as threatened under the EPBC Act. What we used was a national indicative fire extent data set, which was a data set developed very quickly by the department from multiple sources, so state and territory agencies responsible for emergency management, to provide sort of a cumulative national view of fire extent. And then we overlap that with a modelled known or likely distribution of species listed under the EPBC Act with our species of national environmental significance spatial data set. And through that analysis, we found out that more than 330 threatened species were in the path of the fires. So we knew that the sort of environmental tragedy that we were facing was pretty huge. But we knew it wasn't just threatened species that were impacted. Lots of species that were previously considered secure before the fire now look to be imperiled. So we knew we needed to broaden our assessment beyond threatened species to other groups. And we also knew that it wasn't just spatial overlap that was going to impact or determine how vulnerable a species was to fire. So we looked at three things. We looked at the spatial overlap between the species distribution and the fire. We also looked at a species conservation status. Was it already threatened, and how threatened was it? And then we also looked at a species traits. So it's biological or ecological or physical characteristics that make it more or less vulnerable to fire. Can they flee? Can they find shelter? Have they lost their food? And so because we're looking at non-threatened species, we needed to draw data from lots of different data sets, not just data that was held by the department. So the Atlas of Living Australia, BirdLife Australia's data. And we also needed to get trait information, those characteristics of species, from lots of different sources, from action plans, from conservation advices, from recovery plans, from published data, from information held in, university researchers' bottom drawers, basically. So we had to really pull together lots of different data sources. Within 3 weeks, we'd identified the vertebrates that were most in need of management intervention, and there were over 90 of them. And then within 8 weeks, we'd identified invertebrates in need of urgent management intervention, and more than 190 of those. And in a similar time frame to the invertebrates, we'd assessed more than 20,000 plant species and come up with a list of about 480 plants that needed urgent management intervention. So the analysis that was done has informed and is still informing the government's response. So it informed how our funding partners prioritised the species and the areas that they were focusing on. It established clear priorities for our open grants rounds that we were running, and it's also now informing further research effort. So I guess in terms of reflecting on it now with a few months past, I think in terms of successes, we were able to establish clear priorities very quickly through a combination of access to spatial data, but also access to a wide range of experts who brought their views to bear and who were willing to drop everything to assist, really. Also, liaison with the states and territories was critical. They were doing their own analysis about, what was happening within their own jurisdictions. So doing that cross-check was really important. It showed that we mostly got it right at a national level, but we were able to tweak around the edges through cross-checking with them and make sure that we were building that public confidence in the data. So I think, largely it was pretty successful. Some of the challenges were in the gaps in the availability and accessibility of data. So before the fires, we had no pre-existing source of national fire extent data that was available to the Australian government. So fire extent data needed to be sourced, agreements for access needed to be put in place, and we needed a process for accessing and aggregating data development, and we needed to understand the limitations. So that was a really big challenge. And then also really illustrated the need for more detailed modelling of species distributions and consolidated fire trait data to inform the basis to understand and quantify and report on the impacts. Some of it was about availability. We've got heaps of data for our 800 bird species and not a lot for our 320,000 invertebrate species. So some of it was about availability, and it's a challenge with a big continent to get good species data, but some of it was about accessibility too, and having additional and more accessible species traits data would have enabled, I guess, a more refined and rapid assessment of all taxa. So we did it, but I think with better data and more accessible data, we would have been able to do it with greater speed and with greater confidence. But all in all, I think it was a pretty challenging but successful exercise. The Royal Commission, I guess, recognised all that work that was done, but also, I think, as Andrew mentioned in the beginning, recognised that all governments need to collaborate better in both their storage and access and of data on species distributions and the status of Australia's flora and fauna, and that working together on this is going to sort of enable us to better respond to these sort of disasters in the future. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Sally, that just sounds like such the journey, and we're obviously so grateful for the work that you and the department have done to make sure that we do protect all of our species, whether they be threatened or not. I want to pick up on one of the things that you said there, because when you were talking about conservation advice, that tends to be locked in the Act, which I don't know about you, but for me, that's typically a printed document or a PDF somewhere that you typically need someone to go and read through. And it's interesting, I might pull in some of our panelists here just to talk about some of the work that they've been doing. Jeremy and Stephen, I know that you were working together on a project that was trying to do just that, which is unlock important data that's hidden in PDFs that we might need to use for these types of responses. Stephen, why don't we just start with you and just talk us through a little bit of the technical side of that, and how do you even do machine learning to help that with? And then Jeremy, we might flip to you and just get a little bit more context about why that was so valuable to your organisation.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. So this project was about automatic tools to convert the text in the PDFs, and in this case, these were the conservation advices and the recovery plans, to take that information and to convert that into reusable knowledge that you can put into a database that could then help data scientists or other people trying to manage the situation, for example, this year. So we focused on the conservation advices and recovery plans. And the idea was to try and create a knowledge graph that links information about, in this case, the different threatened species, which ones coexist, which ones interact, information about the environment, ecological attributes, threats, and risk mitigation actions. And the idea was to try and do that automatically, so that we would have a system that we could run whenever the set of documents gets updated. So take some of the pain, I guess, out of doing that manually. So this project was a feasibility study to see to what extent we could automate this task. And our intention, obviously, was to try and help with maybe some productivity gains for the various workflows to do with conservation and management of the environment. You wanted to know about some of the challenges. It's not just about extracting tables or converting PDFs to text. We know that such technologies exist and they have some limited use already. It's about taking that data once you've got the machine readable text, trying to transform it into a form that we can then use for downstream purposes. And in this work, it was an interesting challenge. We wanted to be sort of agnostic of the downstream use, because we wanted to have it as widely applicable as possible. So some things that make obvious sense to us as human readers when we look at this machine readable text, these are the sorts of things that can confound an automatic system. So, if there's in a paragraph, it mentions the koala lives in a certain environment, and the next sentence says, this species is ... The fact that you've used a different linguistic way to talk about the species, you said the phrase "this species," can make it hard at first to link this kind of data. So we had to do what's called co-reference resolution to try and link the different facts, take into account things like the document structure, so that we can provide the overall document context together with that little factoid that we extracted. And this really was a big part of the project, to maintain that context, so that downstream, when you come to use this information, you know exactly where it came from, what was the discussion or the document context beforehand, and how it all links together.
That's awesome, Stephen. Thank you so much. So it sounds like if, Sally, this was to happen again, we might even have a thing that could help you do it a lot faster. Jeremy, I know that you were the co-creator in this. I'm keen just to get a sense from you about, was it trying to solve the problem that Sally was talking about, or was there a different type of challenge that you were trying to use this technology for in that instance?
Well, I'd say we started the project before the bushfires came up, so it wasn't specifically for the bushfires, but it's the overarching question that we have within the department is we get so much information coming in text files, PDFs are the main ones. Can we extract that information and make it useful? So I think that's the overarching question. We focused on the conservation and recovery plans because they have a lot of information, a lot of historic information that can be pulled out and used. And one big hole, I think what Sally was talking about is very good on that, is a big hole was the threats linking up to the threatened species. So what is actually impacting the threatened species? And what Stephen did and so well is that they were connected up, each threat was connected up to the multiple threatened species where the threat was. So it's a proof of concept, and we are planning or wanting to continue that and make it applicable to policy areas so we can actually use that information directly and put it into helping potentially update the conservation advice and recovery plans, or putting it into other policy areas. We talked about challenges. Sort of the challenges that I thought, and it's been mentioned previously in the other panels or the earlier panels, is bringing this AI stuff into the public service to try and make it sort of BAU, a usual type of thing of how do we use it. And the change management, I think, behind that is, I keep on, when I'm talking about the work that my team does, is that we're not trying to take people's jobs. We're trying to complement what they're doing so that they can free up the time to do the more important thing, do the higher end analysis. For example, what Sally needed for the threatened species is, if you have more information, better information, quantitatively brought together, you can give that better advice and hopefully better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeremy. I certainly hear a lot about some of that fear when we talk about AI, and certainly the way that we always look at it is it's an us plus game, that it's not a replacement. It is simply just giving us smarter tools to be able to accomplish more with what we have. And on that, actually, I'd love to bring in some of our other panelists. And this would be Jane and Petra. I'm going to be looking at you with your matching backgrounds. I'm loving that. You're a little bit more prepared than I was. I'd love to hear a little bit around AusCrop and what you were looking to achieve in that project, and whether you had any of this similar kind of challenges that we just heard from Stephen and Jeremy, or whether there were some other different lessons that you took. Jane, how about we start with you?
Okay. So I think, this was again another multi-agency collaboration, and also so the ABS and Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, and the Department of Agriculture, and also a couple of areas within CSIRO. A key thing there was about taking existing public data and then value adding to it. So our particular focus was around using remote sensed vegetation cover and climate data, and then finding some site data based on land management practices. And we were particularly interested in agricultural practices and cropping practices, because they're needed for a number of purposes for our reporting on adoption of sustainable practices under things like the National Land Care Program, for international reporting for our greenhouse gas emissions, and also from the ABS perspective of coming up with alternative sources of data rather than doing the traditional surveys. So that was sort of the motivation for it. And I think having a collaborative approach, having the data scientists with their perspective on the machine learning, the remote sensing people, also people with an understanding of how those practices, in our case tillage and stubble management, could be detected in a visual sense from a remote sensing perspective, and how they play out in terms of how farmers manage their landscape. It was sort of like a value add activity using that existing public information. And I suppose it was a proof of concept is where we got.
Yeah, absolutely. And Petra, as I guess a data scientist yourself, as the co-collaborator on this project, what would you share with our audience was one of your key learnings or key takeaways from having to deal with lots of different data and that interoperability challenge?
Yeah, thanks, Alexia. I think there were a few different challenges and learnings that we had along the way. I guess an important learning from this project is the lack of sufficient site data to calibrate land-based national scale agricultural land management practice models in Australia. So there seems to be this sort of misconception around the availability of reliable field data, and that we could just take any type of data set that's been collected and use it in some particular way to sort of value add, and also to solve a wide range of problems. And what we found is that finding reliable field data at the right time and scale with the right attributes is actually really challenging. And we just can't take a data source that people think might be valuable and hit the ground running. There's a lot of discussion around, what is the actual use or utility of this particular data set. We also found that there are benefits in being able to visualise and analyse different data sources. And we didn't have that capacity at the beginning of the project, but we actually developed as part of that project a tool with the help of a computer scientist, software engineer that we had on the project. Sam developed this really great tool that allowed us to bring in the data sets that we wanted to use and zoom in on various land parcels and areas, bring in the remote sensing, and just make sure that we were using the right data sets and right information. I think another thing that Jane touched on is that multidisciplinary engagement. So understanding the problem from both a data science and agricultural system perspective was really, really valuable. So having our ag and food and land and water colleagues in there was really great, because they could bring a different perspective into the mix.
Excellent, thanks Petra. And Nick, in the final minutes of this panel, I'm really keen to hear your perspective. When we hear the story from Jane and Sally and Jeremy, a lot of their work is kind of trapped in legislation and other data sources. And from what I understand, your work looks at taking that data out, turning it into some kind of rules and getting that automation from it. Where do you think from here? You've been involved in that PfOD process for some time. Where do you think we can go from?
So to give first a tiny bit of context around what we've been doing in this project. So we started from the perspective of digital legislation, which is a concept that aims to reduce regulatory burden through automation. So by offering the ability to interpret data and verify whether that's compliant to the relevant regulations. So the idea here is to represent legislation in a digital and more structured way, such that it's machine interpretable yet still understandable by humans. So you can got a one-on-one relation between the clauses in English and the digital counterpart. So having those digital rules on one hand and data on the other hand, it allows you to automatically check and prove compliance to the underlying regulations. So if you can really take all the data that you collect in the field, and you've got regulations, guidelines and policies on the other end, you will be able to actively monitor and reliably and objectively come to a conclusion whether you're doing well or whether there are some changes required, whether you want to actively adapt your workflow, so to say, in order to make sure that you make it to all the policies and regulations behind it. So in this particular project, this was specifically aimed at legislators and legal drafters to make sure that we have a streamlined implementation of those regulatory changes into the supporting information systems. And basically, we investigated the best method to embed legislation into software such that its behavior reflects the actual requirements set by the underlying regulations. So we focused on evaluating digital rule authoring methods and identifying areas for improvement, along with techniques to manage complexity and improve basically scalability. So as such, we basically hosted a number of workshops involving various legal drafters and analysts from various governmental departments, and evaluated different techniques in hands-on sessions to experiment with the relevant aspects of the authoring process and try to identify all the improvements that were possible here to further advance the digitization and really make sure that you can reduce your cost, you can better facilitate compliance, you have objective measures behind it, and you're also able to quicker adapt to regulatory changes. So in our project, it already showed that you can actually write legislation in such a way that is more suitable to be automatically digitized. But also it allows to remove the intermediate steps to basically structure underlying legislation to increasingly technical specifications, but without technology, we are able to do it in one go. So you've got your plain English legislation, and you can in one go then go to a more structured format such that it's still understandable by the drafters, but you can immediately adopt that in reality, so to say. So we are currently working.
The work that you've done and the work that Stephen's done, if we were, not that we'd want any of what's happened in the 2020 to repeat itself, I think we can all put that in a bag to the side. But Sally, if you had another of these challenges that you needed to rise to with some of the technologies that are being developed in this particular group, going forward, it would be easier to extract information from your legislation. It would be easier when you're doing updates to be able to know what's going to be impacted, as these two things helps get you that detailed understanding of what's happening without having to read the several hundred pages and dial an expert.
Yeah, I think that's right, Alicia. I think that would definitely help speed up the process.
Now, look, panel 3, as much as I'd love to continue the conversation, we are almost at time, so I might just need to call it there. Again, thank you so much. I'm sorry that you can't hear the hundreds of people dialed in, but again, thank you very much for your contribution. And I hope that our lovely audience, that you are as impressed as I am with the fascinating discussions that we've had today. It's been really interesting for me to hear about the lessons that not only the Data 61 people have learnt, but also all of our government agencies about how to take innovation from where it is into the next step. Before we round out, I might just see, we don't have a lot of time for Q&A. We have seen some questions come through and I've tried to pull them into the panel discussions, but I might just throw to one of my esteemed colleagues, Emma Burns, who heads up the Government Relationship Group, just to see if she's got to share any thoughts about today.
Thanks, Alexia. I'm just very grateful for everyone participating and coming together. I mean, my reflection would be that, you know, innovation is really a contact sport, and it takes a transdisciplinary mindset. So we need to be enabled to come together, identify the problem together and explore the pathways to solutions. And the process is the success factor, not always the outcome. But we do need to be mindful of the adoption gap. We have a lot of proof of concept, so we need to figure out the mechanisms and the processes where we can start to adopt some of these technologies. But otherwise, I hope the discussion has stimulated some thought. I found it really interesting and engaging, and I'm very grateful, Alexia, for you moderating and for all of our panel members. So thank you. I will say we had one question. I'm not sure if we still have people online that can answer it. And it was in relation to, it says, there has been a lot of positive action making open government data available for citizens. Are there any broad strategies for open metadata to help them correctly interpret data? So it's almost like a question that spans all three of our themes today. But I'm not sure if anyone on the panel would like to respond to that question.
We've got about 1 to 2 minutes if anyone would like to give it a red hot go. If not, we can always take that on notice. I can see who posted that on the side of the chat, and we'll make sure that we get back to you and deal with that question accordingly.
Hi, Alicia, can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. It just as a sort of an answer to that question is the broad strategy is that at the moment there's a APS-wide project being run under the Data Champions banner to establish a metadata standard for the APS. Mostly, I suspect mostly it'll be used for internal use rather than open data, but I suspect it will probably translate into open data. But the idea is that we can actually have meaningful metadata for the data sets that we hold and hopefully we'll be making open. So that, with any luck, if that works, then that will, one of the aims of that will be for people to correctly interpret the data. So yes, there is some work going on currently in that space.
Excellent. Thank you for that, David. That was really insightful. So there you go, Sam. You've got the answer to your question. We are thinking about doing some of that for internal government data, but hold the phone. We might be able to see if that can be made for all open data in 2021 and beyond. We might just need to keep on going because, folks, we are almost completely out of time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's calendars for the time that you've given us today. It's been a really good farewell to PfOD. We've learnt a lot, and it's been great to share all of our lessons learned, some of the challenges, and share the achievements with each other. We've heard how access to innovative R&D can really push the data and digital agenda forward. And while there has been much accomplished over the past couple of years, this is still only the beginning of what is a very exciting journey of where we can take open data, sharing sensitive data, and making use of it for the better of our country. I recognise there are some questions that have come through that we haven't got to, and we apologise, but unfortunately time does keep moving in a linear fashion, and especially towards the end of the year, it moves a lot faster than we'd like. So for those of you who we haven't addressed your questions, we will take those and we will try and get back to you one-on-one. If you'd like to pick up the conversation with us before this session and also after, we'll be sending out to all attendees the link to the PfOD website, where you'll be able to find out a lot more detail about the projects that were mentioned today and the rest that didn't quite get the opportunity to demonstrate and discuss with us today. It'll also have some details about how you can get in contact with the Data 61 team if you'd like to get any more information. And remember, of course, this was recorded, so if you'd like to relive any of your favourite parts of the conversation, you can do so once we've published this particular recording. So thank you first to all of our speakers. Andrew and John, thank you for leading the day, and to all of our panellists, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your insights. Thank you very much to all of our participants and joining us online to hear about PfOD. We wish you all a safe and happy festive season and a great start to 2021. Thank you very much. And goodbye for now.